Welcome to the Health Revolution. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be describing what health actually is. And firstly, I'd like to say that if we're unlucky enough to lose our health, the first thing we tend to do is to seek out a doctor. Now, this is a problem because doctors don't study health, and this actually comes as a surprise to many people. We assume that doctors are experts in health. But unfortunately, at no time in the 6 years at medical school do they actually study healthy people. They don't do more than usually half a day of nutrition. They know almost nothing about minerals and vitamins, which is incredibly surprising. Now, when I did exams, I did them, forgot them, went out and probably got drunk. We imagine that doctors remember everything they've ever been told at medical school, but unfortunately this isn't always the case, as I found out to my cost some 27 years ago when I went to doctors asking advice, and they suggested a heavy dose of antibiotics. Now, after that dose of antibiotics, I rapidly became very ill with diabetes and arthritis, and very soon found myself pretty much crippled, unable to put my shoes and socks on, and ended up in hospital. They gave me all sorts of advice at that point because I became type 1 diabetic, and they said, for instance, eat less salt. You'll need to eat a lot less salt now that you're diabetic. You have to be careful about your health. So I followed this advice for about 10 years, which coincided with getting incredibly painful leg cramps all the time. And it was only finally when somebody said to me, well, you do realize you're just low on salt, don't you? Those cramps will go away. And I started eating more salt when indeed the cramps did go away. And I've seen many cases where not only have doctors advised me recently to go on to statins, for example, they're constantly trying to persuade me to take one drug or another, to which I always refuse. Now, statins have been given to something like 10 million people in the UK. I'm not sure of the exact number. However, their efficacy is being questioned day after day. And just recently, a lot of research has been done into blindness caused by statins. And it does seem that for every one person cured from a heart issue, 50 others suffer from the statins from other issues. Now, for 40 years since we've been given the eat low fat, eat low cholesterol advice, people have been having all sorts of problems related to their hearts, related to many parts of the body. Now, just today, the Daily Express has got an article which says, eating fat is good for you. Now, for the last 40 years, they've been saying it isn't. How come they've suddenly noticed now that it's good for you? It could be that 2 weeks ago on this very program, we had Natasha Campbell-McBride telling us that it is indeed good for us. And clearly the cream's always been called the cream for a very good reason. And the leader of one of the big statin studies, Dr. Peter Kokinos, a couple of years ago, and this was also on the front page of the Daily Express, said that mild walking or feasible gardening or mild exercise would be as good or better than statins. That was the guy who led the study which persuaded the NHS to go ahead and buy that particular brand of statin. Now, there's been quite a lot in the news this week about drugs companies, and September the 24th, it was announced that one of the world's most common heart drugs, a drug called digoxin, which actually occurs in about 40 different heart medications, actually increases the risk of fatal heart attacks, the very thing it's given to avoid, by 72%. Now, this drug, digoxin, has been around for ages. It's very strange that it's taken them so long to find out that the studies that they originally did were wrong for some reason. Or, as is with the case with many of these studies, they only study the drug for 6 weeks. They never study it for 2 years or 5 years. They don't study it mixed with another common drug that might be given for a similar complaint. It's a very small-minded, short-sighted way of doing business, I feel. Now, another article today is about mammograms. It turns out, it says here, that a new NHS mammography leaflet warns that the technology is 3 times more likely to pick up a benign abnormality, which may result in chemotherapy or a mastectomy, than an actual life-threatening tumour. So this new leaflet is being made available to 3 million women, and so many studies now over the last decade have showed that mammograms, which are in themselves very dangerous because it's not just like having an X-ray, it's like having several hundred X-rays all at once. That's the power of it. It's also been shown that the X-rays damage the tissue of the breast, and all the recent research that's been done on mammograms would suggest that they are more dangerous than the advantages that they may give the women receiving them. Now, all these things that I'm suggesting and saying, I do recommend that you check them for yourselves, because I wouldn't want to be responsible for you having any sort of medical disaster. So this program is all about self-education, and I'm doing my best as a researcher to tell you the most interesting things that I've come across recently. Now, one of the other recent things, well, actually, this is back in 2012, actually, from the very prestigious journal Nature. 2 doctors, Glenn Begley and Lee Ellis, double-checked the results of 53 different landmark cancer studies, and they were only able to reproduce 11% of them, which would indicate that 89% of them are bogus. Now, we're relying on these tests, we're relying on these experts to tell us what we should be doing, which drugs, if any, to be taking. And it does seem to be turning out that the advice we've been given is flawed at best and dangerously overprescribed as well. Now, again, this week a report's come out from America saying that the use of omega-3 supplements, that would be things like hemp oil, flax oil, fish oil, evening primrose oil, the use of omega-3 supplements among adults aged 55 and over diagnosed with coronary heart disease could reduce annual hospital costs by more than $2 billion on average. Now, that's really quite a lot. They're also saying that taking lutein and zeaxanthin would save $57 million in eye-related diseases, although these days astaxanthin is considered probably the better alternative. And when I improved my eyesight, I used astaxanthin, vitamin C, bilberries, and L-arginine as the primary way to do it. And I would recommend everybody looks into those very natural substances. High doses of vitamin C, of course, are useful in so many ways. Now, there have been some interesting studies recently done about the well-known painkillers like paracetamol, Nurofen, ibuprofen, well, Nurofen is ibuprofen, and Tylenol. Turns out that Tylenol, just once a month, raises child's asthma rate by 540%. It turns out that paracetamol is also very dangerous from a similar perspective. It says here, giving babies liquid paracetamol preparations such as Calpol may increase their chances of developing asthma by the time they are 5 or 6. Children who are given the preparation at least once a month as babies are around twice as likely to develop asthma and 3 times more likely to have developed a wheezing cough by the time they're small children. That was from researchers at the University Hospital of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Now, it's been shown that sour cherries are as effective, in fact more effective, than the painkillers for taking pain away. And sour cherries are easily got all year round in their dried form. So one could pop them in a liquidizer, add some water, blend it up, and it makes it a delicious drink, effective for so many things, particularly effective for gout, for example. Now, another piece of research study from the Harvard School of Medicine, who are always pretty on it, they published a paper just recently looking at the eating habits of 27,000 men over 45. All the men worked in healthcare and were free of heart disease and cancer. After a period of 16 years, researchers found that the men who skipped breakfast had a 27 higher risk of heart disease to the men who ate breakfast. So eat breakfast, men. Now, the next piece of information I have for you is about glyphosate, that well-loved chemical that they spray on most agriculture these days. And it really is a very, very serious problem because it's getting into the water table. And it's taking some time to get into the water table and some time to get into the cells of people. And in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be speaking with an extremely interesting health practitioner who's been seeing glyphosate poisoning turning up in his practice. And he's going to come on and describe it and describe how to get rid of it. But it is increasingly important, as we're being subjected to more and more chemical toxins, that we avoid the dangerous foods that you might find in supermarkets. You know, to be well, it is necessary to eat the sort of foods that our ancestors ate wherever possible, or at least to get as close to that as we can. Interestingly, with glyphosate, one can see the rise of autism going pretty much hand in hand with the rise of glyphosate being used on the soil. Just getting back briefly to cancer for a minute, I've just been beginning to read a book called Mind Over Medicine by Lisa Rankin, and she tells of this incredible mind over matter bit of research that was done where they gave a group of cancer sufferers injections of a saline solution, and they told them that it might be chemotherapy. Now, generally, as the placebo system works, people given chemotherapy, they're obviously taking the chemotherapy because they believe it's going to work. People given placebos for chemotherapy generally tend to often feel it's working, even though it may be the placebo. In this case, given the chemotherapy drug, 30% of the people given the saline solution lost their hair, which is quite a remarkable figure. When I first learnt hypnosis, which was a study that I undertook some years ago, I met the chief surgeon of Ireland, who explained to me that when possible he wouldn't do operations using anaesthetic, but would use hypnosis. And I've found that the power of the mind is so extraordinary, it's necessary to think very carefully about what one thinks. I learnt just recently about Mesmer, who I always used to believe was the father of hypnosis. And one of the other people we'll be interviewing later on in the series will be one of the leading experts on mesmerism. Did you know, for instance, there were mesmerism hospitals in England? You may not know that there are homeopathic hospitals, but we'll get back to that in a minute. But the mesmeric hospitals were very interesting. Now, Dr. Mesmer was French, and he was around before the French Revolution. And he wasn't giving away the secrets of mesmerism lightly. He was selling them for the equivalent of about £500,000. And Charles Dickens bought the secrets of mesmerism. Rasputin bought them. The sister of the King of France bought them. And indeed, many of the French rich noblemen of the time bought his secret. Now, after the French Revolution, a lot of those French noblemen died, but Mesmer himself escaped and disappeared for 20 years, and later turned up again. And the person we'll be interviewing about mesmerism, he was taught by an 80-year-old Swiss healer who had worked with Rasputin for the last 3 years of his life. And so this story, which we'll hear, is exceptionally interesting, because mesmerism actually isn't a primitive form of hypnotism, but rather it's energy medicine. It's done by the power of the mind and small gestures, and it is incredibly successfully powerful. Now, to carry on with the news for this week, researchers from Maryland have found that giving magnesium reduces cerebral palsy by 90%. Now, this is very, very interesting, because magnesium is one of the most overlooked of all the minerals. And recently I had the experience of speaking with a lady who was just going to qualify as a medical doctor. And I asked her what she knew about magnesium, believing that she probably knew quite a bit, it being so important to stop heart problems and to make sure one wouldn't have a stroke, for example. But I was very surprised to know that she didn't know anything about it. It didn't appear that she'd been told about it yet. The funny thing is that surgeons are taught about it quite routinely, because they need to know that it stops preeclampsia. They need to know that if you inject magnesium sulfate into somebody who's having a heart attack, whereas perhaps normally 4 people may die, 3 out of those 4 would now survive if they were given magnesium sulfate. And the advice that health specialists tend to give now, the alternative health specialists, is to use magnesium chloride as a spray onto the skin. It's, in Chinese terms, called the beauty mineral, and it stops, as many of you may know, muscle cramps, twitches, spasms, and one of the most important nutritional lubricants, you might say, for the heart. Now, the Alliance for Natural Health have come out with some interesting statistics. They've been looking at deaths from pharmaceutical drugs as opposed to supplementation. And they found that you are 62,000 more times likely to die from taking a pharmaceutical drug, just one of them, than you would from taking one supplement. So I think confined supplements are exceptionally safe and certainly necessary in this time where the soil has been rather tragically reduced in its quality. Another result from the journal Nutrients, they've found that calcium supplementation increases the risk of heart attack by 27 to 31% and increases the risk of stroke by 12 to 20%. Now, this is unusual because we have been told by the sort of standard medical authorities that taking calcium as a supplementation is almost generally across the board a good idea. But modern health advocates now seem to feel that rather the opposite is true, and calcium supplementation is hardly ever necessary. It's really magnesium supplementation that is essential. Now, another interesting study here, I think, from Harvard again and the University of Rochester, it shows that premature death increases about 35% with people who don't say how they feel. It turns out that they did a study with about 800 men and women with an average age of 44, and they assessed the survey by whether they suppressed their emotions or not. And this involved agreeing or disagreeing on a scale of 1 to 5 with statements such as, "When I'm angry, I let people know," or "I try to be pleasant so other people won't get upset." So the survey was repeated 12 years later, and out of those 800 people, 111 had died, almost all of them from heart disease or cancer, and it was all to do with the fact that they weren't sharing their problems with other people. They were bottling it up. Interestingly, 50% or more of heart attacks happen directly after an outburst of anger. So keep calm. University of Cambridge School of Clinical Medicine. The researchers collected and analysed data for 19,496 men and women from 45 to 79 years old. And they were studied for 4 years. Overall, those with the blood levels of vitamin C ranging in the top 20% were 50% less likely to die from all causes than those in the lowest 20%. So now, clearly, I think as we all know, very few of us are eating enough vitamin C, and it's one of those vitamins we can't make. So supplementing with vitamin C is very important. Now, just talking about vitamin C supplementation, almost all the vitamin C these days is made from genetically modified corn from China. So you want to be very careful with vitamin C supplementation. Ideally, you want to go for a pure powder, either a pure fruit powder or pure sodium ascorbate or ascorbic acid powder. But these days you want to make sure it is GMO free. Very, very important. The GMO corn is perhaps the most dangerous of all the GMO foods, and food is health, and I would do everything in my power to avoid GM food. But it's becoming increasingly difficult as it's slipping in here or there. You may have heard that China sent back a huge wheat consignment to the USA because it was highly contaminated with genetically modified wheat, which the Americans had claimed had been out of the food supply since it was found to be dangerous and outlawed in year 1. Their idea that genetically modified food could ever be safe, I feel, is patently ridiculous. Some questions are coming in about what type of magnesium to use. And my favourite magnesium is magnesium chloride, which is used on the skin. You can spray it directly on the skin, particularly just after you've had a bath or a shower or before bed. And magnesium chloride doesn't upset the bowels, which when taking magnesium internally, it can upset the bowels. So magnesium chloride is very cheap. Some people find when they first try it, it stings, which is usually a sign that you're very low on it. And if it stings too much, you can always dilute it with pure water and save the rest of it for later. Now, is there any other questions coming up? Somebody has asked about bleeding internal piles that are very, very painful. Now, I would say the first thing to do there is to get some fermented vegetables or probiotic drinks inside to heal the gut. Watch the program. We did 2 programs back with Natasha Campbell-McBride because she explains all about healing the gut, which is vital because 85% of the immune system is in the gut. So if you've ever had chlorine, fluoride, drugs from the doctors, particularly antibiotics, or drunk chlorinated water, your gut is going to be compromised. Somebody's saying that magnesium oil, or the magnesium spray we've been talking about, reduces spots on the face. Yes, it would. People saying it helps you relax at night. It's brilliant for panic attacks. If you want to stop a panic attack, anxiety, magnesium chloride is very, very, very powerful for that. And now, going back to a bit of old news, this is from 1949, and I rather like this one because it's to do with Fred Klenner, who was one of the genius doctors whose work isn't taught to doctors currently. Reviewing the findings of McCormick in 50 confirmed cases of poliomyelitis in and around Toronto, Canada, during the epidemic of 1949, he found that families eating brown bread who came down with polio did not develop paralysis, whereas in those families eating white bread, many of the children did many of the children having polio did develop paralysis. The point here is that brown bread has 28 more times vitamin B than white bread. So it seems pretty clear from that the paralysis was an acute complication of polio caused by a B vitamin deficiency. Now, B vitamin deficiencies are very, very interesting. In the 1960s, there was another Canadian doctor who was a psychiatrist, and he showed at the end of his career that 90% of his schizophrenic patients had been cured using vitamin B3, which is niacin, and vitamin C, and a general vitamin mineral supplement. And most of the diseases of today are nutrient deficiency diseases. And it's very, very important to realize that no matter how well we're eating, it's very difficult to get all the nutrients we need from food these days. Supplementation is very, very, very important. Now, moving on, this is from the New England Journal of Medicine, another very prestigious medical journal. Cancer diagnosis increases the risk of heart attack 26 times. So it turns out that people who've just been told that they have cancer have a 26-fold increase in the rate of heart attacks, which is because they've been frightened to death, literally. You know, doctors, unfortunately, say things like, you've got cancer, you've got 3 months to live. And many people literally subconsciously time their body clock on the time that the doctors have been given. So never believe a diagnosis. You might die from it. Now, I was talking about genetically modified corn a minute ago. And there's a report here, a nutritional analysis of genetically modified corn, showing that non-GMO corn has 437 times more calcium, 56 times more magnesium, and 7 times more manganese than GM corn. This meddling with the genes of animals is really dangerous. Personally, I don't want the genes of frogs in my vegetables, which is what they're doing. It's crazy. Now, finally, before we close up for this evening, I'd like to talk briefly about iodine deficiency, which many people are suffering from right now. And I'd just like to run through the symptoms of iodine deficiency for those of you who don't know. If any of you are thinning around the eyebrows, the eyebrows are getting thin. Any of you have got very rough elbows. The skin just there on your elbow should be as silky smooth as the rest of your arm. If it's not, it's indicative of possibly a thyroid issue and an iodine issue. If your temperature is out of control, it's not, you've got cold hands and feet, sometimes you're very hot, sometimes you're very cold, could well be an iodine issue. Could also be being low on essential fats. Hair loss, hoarseness, dry skin, constipation, depression, menstrual problems can be connected to both iodine and magnesium, as can muscle cramps. Poor memory, the inability to concentrate, weight gain. So many factors are controlled by iodine, and there are many types of iodine to go for. The one that I favour, because the price is very good, is Lugol's iodine. There's another one which is very, very popular called nascent iodine, which is ideal for children because it's relatively tasteless. I would advise everybody to remember that these days it is a good idea to take a really good multi-mineral and also fulvic minerals, the soil-based minerals. Very important to get all those trace elements which are so woefully lacking from food these days. Now, a couple of last things. I'd like to talk about temperature again in relation to infections. Now, doctors always believe that your body has gone wrong in some way and they can fix it. I believe, and I think the health revolution is about the belief that your body always knows what it's doing. Your body is always doing the best for you all the time. And if something apparently appears to be going awry, it's just simply the body is doing the best it can in poor circumstances. So the poor circumstances could be brought about through physical accident, could be brought about through toxicity, or could be brought about through nutrient deficiency. And it's certainly worth looking at the idea that we're all toxically poisoned in one way or another, and certainly almost all of us are nutrient deficient. Even when I was eating a really, really good diet, and that was 27 years ago, I found that it wasn't good enough. I was eating the wholemeal bread, I was eating the high quality food, but it still wasn't enough to stop me becoming diabetic, arthritic, and a whole host of other problems. So my problem was that I waited until it was too late. I didn't take any preventative supplementation whatsoever, whereas now I try my best to persuade my children to take some supplements as a prevention, because I'm really well aware that when they pay attention and they take vitamin D, for example, they don't get colds and flus. If they don't pay attention, they tend to. My son, who's 20, just told me how much better he feels now he's given up the processed fast foods and is taking the supplements even though it's irregular. And his weight has dropped off. He's suddenly become the super fit person he always wanted to be without trying. Because if you do get the right nutrition, then simply you find that your natural weight occurs. I was in a museum the other day looking at photographs from the 1950s and 60s, photographs of people in high streets, and it really was surprising that obese people were completely absent from the photo, and people that were fat were really, really pretty rare. And we need to realize that we're being poisoned by the modern ingredients put into food. And if you can find a way to cut down on any fast foods that you're having, cut down on any fizzy cola type drinks, try not to eat processed carbohydrates, and you'll find remarkable things happening with your health. Because what the doctors call diseases like type 2 diabetes simply isn't a disease. It's simply a nutritional deficiency, as is, for example, fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia translated means many muscle pains, and doctors treat it as if it were a disease. They say you've got fibromyalgia, but actually what they're saying is you've got multiple muscle pains. It's not a disease. You can't look at it under the microscope and see it. It's simply a nutritional deficiency and possibly a toxic poisoning. So I hope to welcome you back next week when we will have another guest with us, and we'll be learning some fascinating facts, I think you'll find, about how to be wonderfully healthy and live happily and intelligently till the very day you die, which may be a long time in the future. All the best. Thank you very much for watching.